Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're joining us. My name is Becca Choate. I'm an Associate for Global Advocacy and Education here with the United Church of Christ, and I want to welcome you to today's Wednesdays with the World webinar. The Wednesdays with the World webinar series highlights the ways in which the quest for justice is intersectional and global, allowing UCC members greater opportunities for increased awareness of global concerns and highlighting options for advocacy and action. Today's webinar is on the state of global racial justice, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, Associate General Minister for Wider Church Ministries and Operations, as well as the co-executive for Global Ministries. Karen Georgia.
Thank you, Becca. It is good to be hosting another Wednesdays with the World webinar. And this afternoon, I want to allow as much time as possible, so I'm going to jump straight in. I just want to thank you all for being present with us this afternoon for this webinar on the state of global racial justice. Quite often we talk about racism, and racism in the United States has a particular dynamic to it, particularly when we talk about anti-Black racism, Afrophobia, and some of the historic ways in which racism manifests itself. More recently, publicly, we've seen the displays that are the racist displays against Asian Americans and people of Asian descent. That's on the rise, and there are all these other ways in which discrimination and racial injustices perpetuate themselves. So this afternoon, I invited to be present with us the Reverend Dr. Philip Peacock, who is a friend of many years. And Philip is going to be our primary presenter and conversation partner. And Philip serves as the Executive Secretary for Justice and Witness with the World Communion of Reformed Churches. And for those of you who may not know, the United Church of Christ is a member of the World Communion of Reformed Churches. We do have the Reformed tradition as a part of our heritage, and we continue to participate ecumenically in that way. We also are a part of the Caribbean and North American Area Council, which is the regional expression of the WCRC. My dear friend and colleague, Dr. Peacock, is a Dalit theologian who has served for several years teaching in the seminary in India. He is married to Kajori Biswas, and they have teenaged twins. So I just want to thank Philip for being here. And even more so, Philip typically works out of Hanover, Germany, which is where the WCRC offices are located. He is currently home on vacation in India. And so the time difference is pretty significant. So Philip, thank you for your willingness to be present. What I've asked Philip to do this afternoon with us is to talk about the state of global racism. So he's going to present for a few minutes on that, and then I have some questions for him. But we're gonna jump right in with his framing of the concerns, particular for these times, when we talk about the manifestations of discrimination, both in terms of racism, racial injustices, manifestations that are about religious bigotry, and even when we talk about casteism and the perpetuation of these kinds of sins. So Philip, I'm going to turn it over to you for framing your remarks and any introductory words that you want to add.
Right. Thank you so much, Karen Georgia, and thank you, Becca, as well. It is a privilege to be with all of you and to engage with these members of our communion. We The WCRC is a communion of 235 member churches spread across 5 different continents. We have 100 million members, and this makes us the third largest Christian communion after the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox. However, though we are so large, nobody knows about us. So it is my privilege to introduce you to the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and perhaps through some of the conversation that we have today, to introduce you to some of the work that we do as well. I'd like to begin by framing this conversation historically, simply because race as a social construct has not always existed. And even if there were forms of discrimination based on certain phenotypes, that means how we looked, these were not necessarily the ways in which racism expresses itself today. So I begin with the very simple idea or concept that race in its present form is actually connected to modernity and Western Enlightenment thinking. Now, while Western Enlightenment thinking presented justice, liberty, and fraternity, it did it in a very, very limited way and for just a particular class of people. It was for the bourgeois class that was emerging as a force at that time, and actually did not include anyone who belonged outside of this very, very narrow construct. Western Enlightenment thinking as an ideology, of course, on the other hand, was almost obsessed with the idea of conquering the world, and I mean the whole living planet, and sought to do it by exerting a certain kind of knowledge system on the world. And this knowledge system was based on the idea of categorization, and therefore also through that process of categorization, exerting power over the other. This is most clearly seen, I think, in the concept of the zoo. All of us perhaps have been taken to the zoo at one point of time or the other in our life. And if you go to the zoo, what do you see? If I refer to Winnie the Pooh, of course, in the book, and the way it says, do you go from the way that says way in to the path that says way out, and you can go to all different areas, or A.A. Mill suggests that perhaps what you want to do is go to the path that excites you the most. Go and see the monkeys or the chimpanzees, the primate. I mean, that's what Winnie the Pooh says. But that itself has a certain loaded problem to it, that in the zoo, we find animals segregated by type. There is a part where the primates are, there's another part where the reptiles are, there is another part where the rodents are, there is another part where the so-called Arctic animals are, and therefore the zoo is a typology of what was actually happening in society. Through a system of Western Enlightenment thinking that was then developed to be called a particular kind of science, things were categorized according to kingdom, phylus, genus, etc. You must be remembering much of this from school. Now, this kind of way of categorization and separation was a way of exerting power and control in order not just to study, but to be able to exert a certain power. And I come back to these words again, over these subjects that one was studying. If one were to go to the jungle, one does not find animals segregated like this. This is a peculiar construction of modernity that wanted to do this. And it did it not just with animals, it also extended it to plant life, to algae, and of course, as an extension, even humans. And the way that they did this, and I'll come back to this a little later when I talk about the colonial aspects of race, is by census. Now, to go a little behind this process, the way of categorizing humans actually emerged out of really anxieties that happened in Europe as it was developing into these various nation states. As Europe was, going through this entire Westphalian process and developing into nation states, it came across perhaps three crises. On the one hand was global geography. I mean, if you look at the map of the world, one would have to question, why is Europe a continent? A continent, by definition, is a large body of land surrounded by water. Europe doesn't meet this definition. It is clearly attached to a greater piece of land called Asia. But Europeans made the map, created the continents, and said that Europe was a separate continent because of culture. They did not use geographical connotations to this, but rather cultural ones. And of course, the part of the world where I come from, which has far greater cultural diversity, is much larger in size, is called a subcontinent. It's something to think about in how geography is actually politics. In the first construct of making Europe a separate continent, they then had the question about, how do we account for our unity while at the same time accounting for our difference, and particularly, what do we now say about the Jews? This slowly began to develop into racial theories that were quickly taken up by very racist scholars of that time, particularly a person called Arthur de Gobineau, who began to write about this, saying that there are different races in the world, and not only are there different races, but to each race is given a particular propensity. And among all the races of the world, it is the Caucasian race which has a propensity for civilization. And this slips into my second point, actually, that this propensity for civilization also was at the same time legitimization for colonialism, along with Christianity, of course. So colonialism used a theory of race to justify its colonializing activities of removing resources from all over the world and bringing it to the so-called center of the world, and justifying it because it was on a colonizing mission. It was on a civilizing mission. It was civilizing the rest of the world. And of course, the rest of the world was categorized into different categories. Each had a different kind of propensity. And to some was a propensity to work, and the others were the propensity to think. And of course, this also manifested itself in certain gendered politics, and even within these communities, gendered politics as well. So this materiality against almost a spirituality and intellectuality was the bedrock on which Western Enlightenment was founded. This, in the colonies, were further further went down in not only justifying the spirit of colonialism, but exerting power over the colonized through the same processes of categorization. So around the world, and I can particularly speak from where the British were colonizing people, they did census. They counted the people and they placed them into very fixed categories. Now, what earlier would have been very fluid categories of people who possibly intermingled with each other, now because of census were fixed and were determined. And among the Tutsis and the I always forget this. The groups in Rwanda, for example, which ended up in genocide, it was basically who had more cows than the other, which group was wealthier in terms of cattle than the other, that these two communities were actually separated. So you see, colonialism had a deep and a very large way of actually enforcing a theory of race, and it was taken to its absolute limits in the transatlantic slave trade, which took people from Africa and right across the Americas and the Caribbean, where they were forced into labor. When slavery ended, and I'm going to slip into this point now, because what happened really was, as this system of racism that was closely linked to the question of slave labor, began to be seen as unprofitable for those who were in power, it became quickly understood that perhaps it would be better to move into a system of capitalism, which would bring more profit to those in power than than from slave labor. And so we mustn't read these histories of the abolishing of slavery simply as the end of racism, but rather the moving of one system into the other, which was more profitable for those who are in power. And of course, in this particular case, most of racialized communities were easily moved into workers in factory situations, so-called being called free, but free in no real terms in which you could express life and life in its abundance. In the particular case of the subcontinent, once slavery was abolished and slave trade was abolished, I should say, what they began to do was do indentured labor. They offered people passage into different parts of the world to work in the plantations there, saying you could earn all this money, but once you went there, they said they're going to charge you for your fare, your ship fare there, your ship fare back, food, board, and lodging, and basically you were stuck and you couldn't go anywhere. Another way in which racism and capitalism colluded together in the system. And even if we go further, we can see, particularly in South Africa, all of these elements being made so abundantly clear. So in South Africa, they had an extremely graded system about which race you belonged to the extent that they would determine where you sat on the bus depending how you looked. And two brothers from the same family would get to sit in different parts of the bus just because they looked different. Apartheid as a system also begins to end because the large companies, the mining companies, began to realize that they could go far further with profit making using the system of race as a base. Could go much farther in profit making than rather a system of apartheid. So we find these systems of race, colonialism, and capitalism engaging. And of course, in my context, the question of caste as well. And this is a very curious history that connects to all of this. When the first colonizers came to India, they wanted to categorize and understand what was happening, but found it extremely difficult to do so. So they went back to the ancient texts, or what they assumed was ancient and a text, because they believed that in this ancient text, truth was to be found. And lo and behold, in these ancient texts, they found the word Aryan, which gave them quickly a linguistic connection, gave them quickly a jump into a racial connection. And this racial connection was quickly adopted not just by the colonizers who wanted to see themselves in these very, very terrible terms, but also by dominant castes in India, who then began to speak of the colonizers as our distant parted cousins. And so there was a collusion made between the dominant forces in India, caste forces in India, and the dominant colonial forces as well, on the basis of race. And caste itself began to be reinvented in terms of a racial system too. Now, within all of this, what we most clearly note is the connections that are made between these various kinds of hierarchies that we have: caste, colonialism, capitalism, race, and all of them engaging together to make a situation that is miserable for those who suffer the consequences of it. Now, I want to do two things before I close. The first is to give you some insight into what the WCRC is doing and has done in terms of the entire question of racism, and then to close with a biblical reflection which highlights a particularly reformed theological problem when it comes to the question of race. So to begin with, I think what we must admit as those who belong to the Reformed tradition is that Reformed theology, like many other theologies, is the theology of the oppressor, but also the theology of the oppressed. And both these groups have been able to take the gospel and appropriate it for themselves in different ways. On the one hand, we have to admit that apartheid is a reformed theology. It arose from reformed roots in reformed universities, drawing from reformed theologies. But at the same time, uh, the resistance to apartheid also arose from reformed roots, using reformed theology and appealing to the reformers themselves. And this is the story that I want to tell you about that is part of really the WCRC's history. Out of the struggle of racism against racism in South Africa arose the Belhard Confession. The Belhard Confession was drafted in 1982 by what was then called the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and was formally adopted by the whole church in 1986. This document raises three important issues of how the churches should deal with the question of racism. These are the questions of unity of all the people in the church and the world, reconciliation, and justice. Now, simultaneously, as the Belhar Confession was being was being written, was being propagated. Actually, it was being distributed. The World Alliance of Reformed Churches, as we were then known, took significant steps to address the question of apartheid on a global level. At the General Assembly in Ottawa, in Canada, in 1982, the Reformed theologian Alan Bosak was invited to give the Bible studies for the entire week, as well as to prepare a study paper on the question of racism. As part of the study paper was a proposal from the Alliance of Black Reformed Churches of Southern Africa to ask the WARC to take a theological and political stance against apartheid. The study guide also pointed out that very little had been done by the WARC against apartheid and that it should take a stance. At the meeting were also representatives from the Dutch Reformed Church and the Nether Dutch Reformed Churches of Africa, churches which supported apartheid. At the opening worship, as a sign of protest, Alan Bosak and 9 other delegates refused to take part in the Lord's Supper, saying that there was no possibility to participate in a joint communion back in South Africa, so they refused to participate in one in Ottawa. Interestingly, this was not only seen as an act of protest, it was also seen as an act of faith. For after all, the Lord's Supper is a communal meal, and there can be no communion unless there's racial justice. This action by Alan Bosak and others created a profound movement within the alliance, and it ended up adopting a statement against racism. As part of the statement, these words were said: "The gospel of Jesus Christ demands a community of believers which transcends all barriers of race. A communion in which the love for Christ and for one another has overcome the division of race and color. The gospel confronts racism, which is in its very essence a form of idolatry." The WARC declared this a status confessionis, that apartheid and racism is a sin and heresy. And it led to the suspension of the DRC and NHK from the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. And they were, even in 2010, when the WARC united with the Reformed Ecumenical Communion, to which these two churches joined, they were not admitted back into the WCRC. Later they were, but there are still problems about this. Today, in the WCRC, we realize that racism is not just a sin as a heresy, but it has embedded every part of our church and our world. It has engaged not only with these three things that I spoken about, but it engages particularly now in this moment with nationalism, and it engages with authoritarianism. And so we have been part of a process that we call RAN, racism, authoritarianism, and nationalism, to address how we as a communion of churches can deal with this crisis of racism that is worsening in the face of authoritarianism, nationalism, xenophobia, and populism in the world over. In the year 2018, we had a conference that brought together theologians of African descent as well as Dalit theologians to discuss this problem and to see how we can go forward. We are still in the process of addressing this issue. We have now before us a term that we are trying to propagate through the WCRC that we are calling global apartheid. The recognition that apartheid is not something that is limited to South Africa, but is expanding around the world. It is found in the denial of healthcare to communities. It is found in forced migrations. It is found in the genocide that many indigenous people around the world are facing, and in so many more examples. And finally, then, I would like to close by addressing this theological issue, which is really a reformed one, the question of election. How can we hold on to a theology of election, which basically feeds a theology of racism? And I want to speak perhaps at this moment about a woman in the Bible who speaks to this story, and that is Hagar. Hagar is a racialized minority in terms of her ethnicity, but she is also a slave and, of course, a woman. Her story is a story of two women, one privileged and the other one not. One the bearer of the promise of the nation of Israel, and the other is abused and thrown away. Yet we know that one conceives the child and the other does not. It is significant that Sarai hopes that the birth of the child will raise a personal status and esteem, but this does not happen, but instead she is despised in the eyes of Hagar. And this is something significant that speaks to us. The birth of something new offers the opportunity of a new relationship evolving, one that is based on justice and love in action. But this is exactly what does not happen. And time again, our nations and communities have had these opportunities to birth something new. We had it at independence, both in the USA and in India. We've had it in the Black Lives Matter movement. We've had it in the number of civil rights movements that we have. And once again now, with what COVID is exposing, we have it again. But instead of using these moments to start something new, rather we retreat back into our communities and harden the lines around races. Hagar, to escape her suffering, runs away to the desert in an obvious parallel to the Exodus narrative. But unlike the God who comes to the rescue of Hebrew slaves, the divine being acts on the behalf of the oppressors and sends Hagar back home. And the divine being, as espoused in this text, is a thug, a bounty hunter, who drags those who are not elected back into their subjugation. And this is a theology we must question. Are our theologies dragging us back again into subjugation, or are they really liberating us? Theologies of election are powerful ideologies for both the dominant and dominated. On the one hand, it legitimizes the dominant. On the other hand, it enables the registration of the self by the dominated. Yet I would argue that the idea of God who does not belong calls us to reconceive election from the perspective of the other. While we do not deny the freedom of God to choose, what we must come to realize that it is always the other that is chosen, that no one has the right to claim chosenness, that it is demanded that one see it in the other, and particularly the marginalized other. To recognize that it is always the other is chosen is to delegitimize all forms of chosenness, and particularly racial chosenness. Therefore, this demands that the dominated do not claim their own chosenness, but also simultaneously reject the claims to election of those that dominate. How do we consider those who are not elected, the minority? The narrative of Hagar is replete with images of sight. In fact, Hagar names God. She does not invoke God, but names God, and names God as one who sees. But what does God see? Does God notice the suffering of the marginalized? Or is God more concerned about the interests of the powerful, of the chosen ones? And this is what the story of Hagar brings to us. It is a tension between the elect and God's choice for the oppressed. And how does the story end? Hagar, unfortunately, experiences exodus without liberation, revelation without salvation, wilderness without covenant, wandering without land, promise without fulfillment, and unmerited exile without return. I'm not going to resolve this. I want to leave the tension as it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. And thanks for the tension that you have left with us around the reflection on Hagar, which was just beautifully done in a short period of time. I think that also what you have raised in terms of God's choice for the oppressed is actually a very powerful narrative. And I actually want to start someplace else because you talked about starting something new, that these moments offer an opportunity to start something new. What do you see emerging in these days?
Okay. Well, so I think, I mean, and I don't use this language callously. I think we are in an apocalyptic moment. Apocalypse is a word that has moved away from our Christian traditions and, well, at least our more liberal Christian, progressive Christian traditions, and has been adopted by two forces. One, of course, is the Christian right, who, you know, if you're familiar with any of this, Karen Georgia, you would know the Left Behind series, the most popular selling books, Christian literature ever, apparently, in which people take absolute glee at the suffering of others. It's the worst case of Schadenfreude that Christians can imagine, but that there it is. And the second space that has adopted apocalyptic language is Hollywood. And you know, the number of apocalyptic films that have come out that talk about the world ending, you know, whether it's meteor crashing into the earth, tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, name you and you have it. And the crux of those kind of stories is always about a man who is estranged from his family. His wife is divorced, is separated, seeing someone else, and his children hate him. But at the end of the story, you will find that the camera panning back on the family, reunited again. The man is reasserted in his patriarchal position of power, but the world around him is collapsing. I think apocalypse in the Bible actually means unveiling. And what we're seeing now is an unveiling of what is actually going on. To see the deep problems, the deep fissures, the deep irreconcilable almost differences that we have here on our planet that is doing such harm to human relationships and human relationships with the earth. And I think what is required then is not to let that, I mean, in this new moment, is to forge new forms of relationships that are based on justice, not reinforcing old ones, not saying we're going to save something from the past, but rather reformulate and reforge new relationships that are based on justice.
I think what you offered is also, I think, what is emerging, I think, in theological spaces that are particularly confronting the COVID moment, and this idea of returning to normal, and what returning to normal means for some people for whom what is normative is actually oppressive, and pushing back against let's get back to normal. We want things to be the way they were, in absence of narratives that critique what actually existed. So I want to push a little bit into some of the the conversation about what is happening now and what is being unveiled,
Right.
which is not new, but somehow this COVID moment, right, has been a magnifying glass on issues that were already existing. So whether it's poverty, lack of healthcare, disease, all of that, right? And as I've said that, I wonder, is it a magnifying glass that's amplifying and helping us to see, or a magnifying glass that's actually heating this up, right? And causing it to burn, because they're both of those things, right? That a magnifying glass does, depending on how you hold that and how you look at it. So as we think about this COVID moment and this, running back to normal, um, particularly around the disparities that pertain to discrimination, what would you offer for the church in this moment? Because I think that um, the church has a particular role to play globally. Maybe what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, first, thank you for the imagery of the magnifying glass. I think that is fantastic to either burn up or to see more clearly. I would imagine that for those of us who are concerned with the world, it is to use it to see more clearly, to have this discernment of reading the signs of the times. But I also want to talk about what you said about this return to normal, go back to normal, this atavistic tendencies that we seem to have that are made so apparent in the slogan, Make America Great Again. Some return to some time in the past, an imagined past, in which these we believe, and this imagined past is when, of course, white supremacy, patriarchy, all of these were their strongest. As soon as this empire begins to crumble, we find this longing among dominant folk to return to a time when their lives were the most secure. But for us who live on the underside of history, who every morning wake up on the wrong side of capitalism, we know that normal is terrible. Normal is just awful. And there is a longing for us for something new. And I think this longing for something new occurs several times right throughout scriptures, right from the time from to the call to sing new songs. I mean, not the same old ones, but it's called to sing new songs. That something that something in the writings of Paul, that something new is going to break through. Creation is groaning as it's giving birth because something new is going to break through. And of course, in Revelation, where there is a new heaven and a new earth, we are not returning to normal. We are not going back to what was in the past, but we have to work towards something new. And if I speak again from the Reformed tradition, it's not something that God does. It's not as if we are on the Titanic, it's sinking, and the best that we can do now is rearrange the deck chairs or something like this. Rather, we know that we can chart a course, we can navigate, we trust the ship to move forward, and it's not the Titanic; it's another ship completely. And we can bring this change about. And I think this is what the church should be doing, to look for this newness. Now, a word of caution here. I think the church in its mission history has often misunderstood this by imagining that we know what to do, that we have the answers. Uh, I would say really we do not. And this is what we need to look for. We need to look for where these new movements for change are emerging and beginning, one, to listen to them, but also let those new movements for change completely discombobulate us, to completely turn us inside out so that we ourselves can be new, renewed while joining that new thing that is happening. Sorry, I'm a bit preachy.
No worries.
Sorry, this is the church.
You touched on a lot. here because I also want to hear your reflections and uh, in the interest of transparency, the consultation between African descendant people and Dalits, we both attended that, and we've also been engaged around some of the work around Rand, around authoritarianism and nationalism, right?
Yeah.
And as we talk about that in the past few years, especially this issue around nationalism, and the radicalness that we've seen emerging from spiritual spaces, the coupling of this nationalistic movement with discrimination, but then also with this religious fervor that accompanies it, and what you would call the naming of chosenness, right? Like this belongs to a particular people. I think that one of the questions is how can and maybe how should the church, right, in a collective witness, be speaking to that? And I also want to bring in, where are the points of advocacy for global, I guess, disruption of these kinds of systems.
Right. Okay. Since you raised the question of nationalism, I would see nationalism really as belonging to this twin couplet of longing and belonging. It's a longing for something that doesn't really exist. There is a nation, by definition, as people want to define it, is a geographical area which is at the same time of one ethnicity, one religion, one language, one people. But there is no nation in the world that is like this, not a single one. Every nation is diverse in all its possible forms. Even often, as we've talked about earlier, geography is politics. What is geographical land and how this is mapped out in actually terms of spaces is also the longing of those in power to exert a certain geographical condition. And it's also the question of belonging. And belonging is complicated because who belongs and who does not is often defined by dominant communities. So I think nationalism as an ideology is extremely dangerous because it longs for the sense of belonging of only a particular group of people. And I have talked about popular culture, but let me refer to some of this popular culture again. In recent times, we've seen a resurgence of movies, video games, and other things which draw from the medieval times. The medieval seems to have come back very strongly, whether this is Narnia on the one hand or Lord of the Rings on the other, and the whole set of tropes between them, including Game of Thrones and all of that. And even in these imagined communities, people are completely white. It is a longing of European society to return to a time when whiteness is normative. Even in imagination, the imagination is completely white. And so there is this, nationalism is based on this kind of longing for just one kind of community, which not just obfuscates, but obliterates in a way any other identity and the other. You are welcomed in only if you are willing to be subservient to this dominant project. So I think this is something that we must begin to question. The church must be a diverse space in all its diversity. And I think that itself offers a certain advocacy to the world, saying the church cannot even be of one type. And I want to really go now into this very, very dangerous area of doctrine. Uh, Doctrine, as it defines the boundaries of our faith, also requires dominating power to do it. And I think that too must be questioned really. That we must question these things that require dominating power to enforce. To be a community, therefore, of freedom, to be a community of liberty, and to be a community of welcoming of all of diversity. I think this is where this is the kind of advocacy that we must through our the regular life of the church. But I think also we must be able as churches to engage with, particularly churches in centers of power, to engage with larger bodies, with national governments, with the United Nations, to push for particular agendas. And churches in the global north have this power, and they should use it for the sake of the global church and those who do not.
So I have a practical question that has emerged. How does a nearly all-white UCC church located in high-income suburban area promote racial justice?
Okay, there are many ways in which this can be done. I'm just going to offer maybe two or three. Firstly, change that. Change the fact that you are, what is the language used? Because I'm going to use exactly that language. All white UCC church located in a high income suburban area. Do what you can to get more diverse, that you're not all white anymore. I think that needs to be done first. And one of the ways of doing it is invest in the education of people of color. Invest in the education of Blacks, minorities, of different ethnicities, of people of African descent, of Asian communities, and put your money there. I would believe if change has to come, it will come from our young people who are educated and are then entering into the system to be able to change it. So these two things very, very specifically. Give scholarships.
That's good. Because, we're having these conversations about reparatory justice as well, that are emerging. And that does kind of tag into some of the questions about, what should predominantly white churches be doing and how can they engage these issues? Because I keep saying that reparations is not about a dollar figure per person, but the ways in which we offer opportunities and the leveling of the playing field. So we are actually coming pretty close to an end here in our time. And this has actually been very rich conversation. So I know that, and I've certainly mentioned here that you are currently in India on vacation. So can you provide for us some reflections in terms of the um, what's going on in India as far as the Dalits and this COVID moment and what it is revealing and amplifying around what was already a problematic situation in terms of casteism?
Right. Well, the question of disease and caste are always closely linked because caste is based on a system of purity and pollution. And therefore, anyone who is, it falls lower down in the ladders of the caste system are considered to be polluted, unclean, disease-bearing, can pass on that pollution. And very unfortunately, these systems of social distancing and COVID protocols that are being put into place are really hardening caste practices. Um, in the sense now, in the name of COVID protocol, untouchability is now being legitimized. We find science coming to the service of the caste system and legitimizing the system of untouchability we have. So that is on the one hand. I'm not advocating for touching at the moment and super spreading, but there is an ideological connection that exists between these. On the other hand, I think what has happened in India is is historic, and it is also new. Historically, India, particularly after 1991, began to cut back on social spending to the extent, and this is where the United States of America and India, are really best buddies. We have been cutting back on our national health spending. Till now, our national health spending is only about 1.3% of our GDP, a pathetic amount. And that's been consistently happening through the years to the extent that our public healthcare system is completely broken. Now, don't get me wrong, India has one of the best healthcare systems in the world if you can afford it. However, a single sickness for someone who comes from a middle class, a lower middle class family will actually push you into poverty. It costs at the moment, if you are in a hospital for COVID, 100,000 rupees per day. Uh, this would be for a middle class family 2 months' salary, and that's a cost per day. If you are put into hospital for 20 days, you are bankrupt. You are forced to sell land, assets that the family have accumulated. So it is doing this. The situation is made worse by the chest thumping and authoritarianisms of our leaders, who at one point of time, just a few weeks ago, claimed that COVID in India was over. They made no plans for a second or third wave that was going to hit. And even more so, what happened was that at the moment in hospitals, I mean, because of the number of cases, firstly, there are no hospital beds, particularly beds to take care of COVID. In several states of the country, the hospital beds that are there don't have oxygen supply or do not have ventilators. And the story is actually, I am now scared to pick up my phone because each time I pick up my phone, I hear of someone else who has passed away. In the time that I had the last conversation with you, Karen Georgia, we lost India's pioneer indigenous theologian, a man by name Dr. Nirmal Mins, and he passed away just in this couple of hours that between that conversation and this one. So the situation is very, very grim. Of course, Dalits, because of the engagement with poverty, plus because in many places people would just refuse to touch them, have lower access to healthcare. Many of the workers of the health system at the lowest rungs who are most in contact with the patients are from Dalit communities, so most vulnerable to COVID. So this is the situation we are in at the moment. Um, yeah, I don't know what to say. Yeah, it's. I mean, it leaves me quite speechless, actually.
I think we're speechless on many things and in many ways. And Philip, I just want to thank you for the many questions that you have raised for us. But I think also the direction that you're pointing us in, which is finding something new. We, of course, are ongoing conversation partners, particularly around the ways in which the United Church of Christ can continue to be a collaborative partner with the World Communion of Reformed Churches as we continue to think through these theological questions and move to finding ways to actually see a just world for all. So I want to thank you for being present with us for Windows into the World for today. And I just want to turn it over to Becca. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen Georgia, and thank you, Philip. It is past midnight your time, so hopefully you can go get some sleep after this. We appreciate you joining us so late in the day for you. Thank you again. And for all of you watching, our Wednesdays with the World series is the first and third Wednesdays of each month, and it's also the fifth Wednesday when we have a fifth Wednesday. Our next conversation is going to be on Wednesday, May 19th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's called The Middle East in Transition and the Future and Role of Its Christians. We'll be in conversation with Dr. Peter McCary, our area executive for the Middle East and Europe, as well as the General Secretary of the Middle East Council of Churches. So we encourage you to register and join us in 2 weeks for that conversation. Karen, Georgia, or Philip, would one of you close us in prayer, please?
Philip, I'm going to ask you to grace us.
Let us pray. God of life, to whom we owe life, but are often untrusting and unbelieving, particularly in situations such as these in which our belief is being tested, in which we watch as life ebbs away from so many around us. We ask not for understanding, but rather solidarity, to be able to hold each other in love, in fellowship, in kindness and compassion, and to know that even if we feel that you are not with us, that we know that our siblings will be, that our church globally will be. And so we offer you ourselves, unsure, uncertain, but knowing that you have given us relationships, relationships that we will build on, to be built on justice and hope and reconciliation and goodness. For we ask in the name of your Son. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if this conversation has moved you, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help programs like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed as you continue your day. Know that you are not alone, and we are holding you in prayer. Amen.